This is the story of a Jewish boy named Itzik. He was born nearly 100 years ago, in 1925. He has 4 siblings, all brothers. He is the second oldest. His parents are Ezra and Leah Slodowski. They live in a small town in western Poland, Ozorków, which is considered part of the greater Lodz region. His father is a schmid, or what we would call a blacksmith. He is big and strong, a necessary prerequisite for the job. At 200 plus pounds and over 6 feet tall, he is considered a giant amongst his peers. All of Ezra's male relatives, including his father, grandfather, great-grandfather, uncles, and cousins, were or are blacksmiths. His mother, Leah, is a homemaker, and she is quite the looker. By all accounts, she is one of the most beautiful women in town. Her family are Webers, or what we would call weavers in English, and have been for generations. As the Lodz region of Poland is known for manufacturing fabrics and textiles, this is no surprise. As Itzik grows, he excels in athletics and is a very talented soccer player. Circled in red is the greater Lodz region of western Poland. The small arrow seen within the circle is pointing to where Ozorków is located with respect to Lodz, the second largest city in Poland, second only to the capital, Warsaw. Ozorków is roughly 30 kilometers northwest of Lodz, so it's equivalent of Opelika or Auburn to Columbus. The population is evenly split amongst Catholics, Lutherans of German descent, and Jews, both secular and Orthodox. The 3 groups live harmoniously, as each group tends to stay in their homogeneous section. The Protestants with their Lutheran churches on one side of town, the Jews with their synagogues on the other, and the Polish Catholics in the center. This homogeneity also extends to the schools. Itzik attends a secular Jewish boys' school similar to the one pictured here. Fast forwarding a few years to the mid to late 1930s, Itzik is approaching 13, or bar mitzvah age. Being a secular Jew, he is more interested in playing soccer than participating in Jewish studies or learning his Torah portion. His athleticism earns him a place on an elite soccer team. He is the only Jew on the team. As the team is quite good, they compete all over Poland to represent Lodz. To the west, the Nazis have risen to power. Austria has been annexed. The racist and anti-Semitic Nuremberg laws have been enacted, and Hitler is on a mission to erase the Jews from Europe. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invades western Poland, including the Lodz region. The Polish army is ill-equipped and is no match for the German army. This is the Polish response to the German invasion, comical really. Most believe that Poland fell in just a couple of days. This is not actually the whole truth. While it was the case in western Poland, the eastern part of Poland was not invaded, at least not initially. Going back to Itzik's story, he and his soccer team are in the far northwest part of Poland, competing near Wilno, while the German invasion is occurring in the west. Word of the invasion eventually reaches his team. Itzik returns to Ozorków. 16 days later, the Russian army invades eastern Poland. With the addition of the Russian invasion, Warsaw falls. Poland is partitioned. Nazi Germany controls western and central Poland. The Russians control the east. With western and central Poland under Nazi occupation, the Nuremberg laws are enforced. Jews are considered enemies of the Third Reich. They are forced to leave their homes and move into ghettos. Those who hesitate are immediately executed. Itzik, who is now 13, just turned 13 a few days earlier, 13, is hiding out with one of his teammates and trying to pass himself off as a Gentile. Why? When he returned from his soccer tournament, his home was abandoned. His parents and 4 brothers were nowhere to be found. The song playing in the background is an instrumental version of a song named Ofen Piperchek. It's a Yiddish song written in the late 19th century. The title literally translated means on the hearth. Typical of many Yiddish songs of the era, the melody is somber and tugs at the heartstrings. Even without knowing the lyrics or what the song is about, the pain and sorrow are unmistakable. The lyrics tell a story of a rabbi teaching young Jewish children the alphabet, or the Hebrew or Yiddish alphabet, and the depth and meaning each letter possesses. Children, in the fourth stanza, the lyrics read, "Children, when you grow older, you will understand how many tears lie in these letters, how much lament. The history of our people is written in tears." Notices in both German and Polish are posted everywhere, heralding, "Harboring or aiding a Jew is punishable by death." Out of fear for his own life, Itzik's teammate turns him in. With Itzik no longer in hiding, he is sent to a makeshift ghetto in Ozerkov. His family is still nowhere to be found. A couple of years pass. Itzik is moved from the Ozerkov ghetto to the Lodz ghetto, the second largest ghetto in Poland, second only to the Warsaw ghetto. This is an alphabetical transport list of occupants leaving the ghetto in Ozerkov to be transferred to the Lodz ghetto. This is a list showing Itzik's name circled in red. The far right column translated means remarks, and it shows his arrival date, the Lodz ghetto 21-7-42, or July 21st, 1942. Life in the Lodz ghetto is difficult due to overcrowding, disease, pestilence, malnutrition, random lineups, and bitter cold. Survival is first and foremost. Having manual skills equates to usefulness in being deemed an essential worker. Being smart and resourceful, Itzik is constantly reinventing himself, changing his skill set, and therefore his usefulness in order to survive. On this document to the far right, his job is initially listed as Naharim, which translated means clothing maker or seamstress, but it is crossed out and Schmid or blacksmith is listed instead. On this list, he's a Schneider or a fabric cutter. On this list, he's back to being a blacksmith. So how is it that we have this photographic accounts of the Lodz ghetto similar to the ones I just showed you and the ones I'm about to show you? Heinrich Ross, a talented Jewish-Polish photojournalist, was instructed by the Nazis to take carefully staged or fictitious photographs to glamorize ghetto life to later be used for Nazi propaganda. Risking certain death, Heinrich Ross secretly photographed the grim realities of what life in the Lodz ghetto was really like. He buried thousands upon thousands of negatives. In 1945, after the Germans surrendered, he returned to Lodz and found about half of these to still be intact. These grim photojournalistic accounts of the Lodz ghetto would later become an art exhibit and would be displayed in galleries and museums all over the world. A typical Nazi raid and lineup in the ghetto, these lines would often lead to spot executions, or, if you were lucky, selections. Those that were deemed healthy, helpful, or essential remained. Those who were selected or deemed non-essential were transported to concentration camps. This slide shows the multitude of concentration camps in Germany, annexed Austria, and German-occupied Poland, more than 1,000. The larger green dots are major labor camps. The red circles with X's are extermination or death camps. The smaller black squares adjacent to the green or red circles are subcamps. Most of the non-essential individuals selected from the Lodz ghetto were initially sent to Chelmno, shown here, and years later to Auschwitz, both extermination camps. Chelmno has the unfortunate distinction of being Nazi Germany's first extermination camp. Victims were instructed to place all of their belongings in storage bins, note the picture to the top right. They were tricked into believing they were going to be transferred to a work camp, but they had to disinfect or shower first. Victims were led up and down a series of ramps, disrobed, and were eventually tricked into a small room, which turned out to be the freight area of this van or lorry pictured here. They were gassed with carbon monoxide from the exhaust funneled into the cargo area as the van drove off. These killing vans, as they've come to be known, there were 4 of them, were driven by prisoners, usually Jews, to a nearby forest, now known as the Killing Forest. Every few weeks, the drivers were executed in order to ensure secrecy. How do we know all these details? Against all odds, 4 people survived Chelmno. 4 out of more than 300,000. Of the 4, 3 survived the Holocaust and gave written or video testimonies of these atrocities. As the Lodz ghetto was incredibly productive, it remained operational until the spring of 1944. Fortunately for Itzik, when the Lodz ghetto was in the process of being eradicated, being strong and a surprisingly fit young man, he was sent to Dachau, a labor camp just outside of Munich, instead of a death camp like Auschwitz. Arbeit macht frei. Work sets you free. When it was certain the Americans and the other Allies were eventually going to capture Munich, prisoners from Dachau were moved deeper into German-occupied territories. Itzik was sent east to Mauthausen, a notorious labor camp in Austria near Vienna. Mauthausen has this distinction as it is adjacent to a massive rock quarry and because of the notorious stairs of death. Prisoners were forced to carry large, heavy rock blocks harvested from the quarry on their shoulders and up the stairs of death. Note the picture, second from the left, and the size of the rocks, estimated to be over 100 pounds. Mauthausen had numerous subcamps, including Ebensee. An image of prisoners from this subcamp is seen on the slide to the far right. It is very likely Itzik was sent back and forth between the main camp and these subcamps. If you haven't figured it out by now, Itzik is my father. Of course my father survived, but the only one from his family. A total of 7 people from his greater extended family survived. 3 cousins from his father's side, 3 cousins from his mother's side. After the war, he emigrated to the US and eventually settled in Los Angeles, where he met and married my mother in the 1950s. In 1954, when he was naturalized, he changed his name to Irving Sloan. Sorry. Okay, so for the fun part. So why am I giving this talk here? Why at this place? Why at the Houston Society meeting? And why did I call this Corresponding Angles? As I said earlier today, for those of you in the meeting, I learned many invaluable skills, both clinical and non-clinical, while I was here at the Houston Clinic in the mid to late 1990s. But one stands out. I was fortunate enough to be selected, along with one other primary care physician, to spend time with Dr. Houston and see patients with him in a clinic. These clinics took place on Friday mornings. There weren't a lot of patients, and they were more of a social visit than a clinical visit. And what struck me immediately is how well he knew his patients. He would ask them how their father was, how their spouse was, how's their grandfather, how was Susie's soccer game, how was Bobby's football game. And the patients' faces were a wonderful sight to see, because at first they were shocked and surprised that he remembered, but more importantly, that he cared. In my 25 years of practicing, first here in Columbus and then in Atlanta, I prided myself on emulating that and to try to be what Dr. Houston was to his patients, and to convey that congeniality. As a result, I got to know my patients extremely well. One of these patients is Gail Cohn. She came to see me in 2012. After a long hiatus, I asked her about her father, who I knew peripherally while I was here in Columbus, Judge Aaron Cohn. She told me that he had recently passed away just a few weeks earlier. She then told me she was returning to Columbus to attend and speak at a commemorative event at the National Infantry Museum, the very place we are right now. Of course, I inquired as to why. She told me the Holocaust section of the World War II exhibit, right behind us, was being dedicated to her father. Impressed but puzzled, I asked, stupidly I might add, why? Because he was a prominent Jewish figure in Columbus? And then she told me about her father's military service. I had no idea. She told me that he was a major in Patton's Third Army and that he had liberated a concentration camp. I was stunned, my mouth dropped. What? What concentration camp? Ebensee, a subcamp of Mauthausen. And I froze. And I said, Mauthausen, your father? Judge Aaron Cohn liberated Mauthausen? And then I proceeded to tell her about my story and my father's story. And we were both sitting in my exam room in tears because of our newly realized connection and, more importantly, our father's corresponding angles. It is now my honor to have my friend, Gail Cohn, come up here and tell the rest of our story.
I am delighted to be here this evening for a number of reasons. Among them, it's a privilege to be on the program with Dr. Reuben Sloan, who is a fabulous doctor, my doctor, and he's a trusted friend. Also, it's a privilege to be with those of you who are attending the Houston Society meeting. Many of you are my Columbus, Georgia family's friends. And I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't let you know that I share in the sadness of the loss of Dr. Champ Baker, who was an incredible friend to my parents and to my family. Of course, it's always a pleasure for me to be in my beloved hometown of Columbus, Georgia, and in this meaningful museum that is so dear to my heart. I come to you tonight as a liberator's daughter, as Reuben comes to you as a survivor's son. My name is, as noted, is Gail Cohn, and I am the daughter of the late Judge, retired Colonel Aaron Cohn. And I want to share part of his story with you for the next 15 to 20 minutes, as Reuben has shared part of his father's story with you. The lives of Itzhak Sladowski and Aaron Cohn are intertwined. They are a history and they are a legacy. And the fact, as Reuben shared, that our lives crossed in this manner is nothing short of amazing. But just to put it into historical context, let's take a look at this military timeline. And this is the military timeline that gets Aaron to Europe. In September of 1943, he sails to Scotland on the Aquitania. And when I noticed that, I realized I was born in August of 1943, so I was only a month old when he left. He did enlist for active duty in 1940 before Pearl Harbor. Then June 6, 1944 is D-Day. August 9, 1944, he arrives at Utah Beach, where he is reassigned to General Patton's Third Army. Now, if you look at that timeline, you can see that they're moving pretty fast, because by September of 44, they're liberating Luxembourg, and a few months later, their unit is 30 miles south of the Battle of the Bulge. And then comes May the 6th, 1945, which is the liberation of the concentration camp of Ebensee, and that's where our story begins. It begins on the outskirts of a beautiful little resort town in Ebensee, Austria. It's got a clock tower, a gorgeous lake. It's towards the end of the Second World War. It's 1945, and this is what the map of Europe looks like. If you notice the pink dots, they are the extermination camps, and the blue dots represent the other concentration camps that are scattered throughout Europe. Concentration camps such as Ebensee established by the Nazis represented the wholesale, deliberate, and systematic murder of innocent people. Aaron is now in the 3rd Cavalry. It is part of the 3rd Armored Division, and they are the eyes and ears of the Corps. Corps' 15,000 men. The average age of the soldier is 19. Aaron is 29 and a major in General Patton's army and the regimental combat officer. He was in a half-track tank, and that half-track tank served as a traveling command post. He had a 15 caliber machine gun, a gun crew, and all orders came out of that vehicle. It was a job that involved life and death of every moment of every day. As Aaron was following close behind one of the tanks, a friend radioed headquarters that they had stumbled upon a concentration camp in Ebensee, Austria. When that happened, Aaron was summoned by his commanding officer because he knew Aaron was Jewish and he would want to be part of that mission. But when he left for that mission, he had no idea what he would find. As he entered the gates of Ebensee, he noticed that the guard towers had been abandoned, that the electrified barbed wire fence had been unarmed. But then as he walked into the courtyard, what he saw was 100 survivors standing in filth in their prison-striped uniforms. Some were naked. Others, as he later described to me, were bones and yellow skin. Dead bodies were everywhere, blankly looking up at the sky, maggots crawling all over them, and the smell of the dead, and the stench of the sick, and the odor of urine and feces was unbearable. The survivors, seeing Aaron in his combat boots and his .45 shoulder holster gun, shrunk back in fear. But he spoke to them in Yiddish, and Yiddish was the language that was the lowland of German, and it was a language that most of the Jews of Europe understood. And he said to them in Yiddish, "Nein, no, I'm not an SS officer. I'm an Amerikaner Major. I'm an American major." And then he said to them, "And I'm Juden, I'm Jewish." Hearing those words, they wept. They kissed his feet. They tore at his clothes. They tried to lift him, but they were too weak. For Aaron, it was beyond emotional. He was forever changed by what he saw, and the sights and the sounds and the smells of Ebensee stayed with him for all of his days. Now, this room knows that the most urgent need is for food and medical treatment. It was particularly difficult to support the camp with food, adjusting to half-starved people, because as I understand it, in those days, we didn't know that much about feeding half-starved people, so many of the survivors died of intestinal disorders after the liberation. The camp remained largely in the care of the 3rd Cavalry reconnaissance soldiers and medical personnel from May the 6th to the morning of May the 9th, and Aaron and 4-star General James Polk remained there together for those days. Documenting history. We find that Ebensee was one of the worst concentration camps for death rates because of the inhumane treatment, the inadequate food, the beatings, and the hard labor in a harsh environment. The 25 barracks had originally been built for 100 prisoners, but later on they held as many as 750. The barracks were cement floors, wooden sidings, leaky roofs, and absolutely no sanitation. The first crematoriums were built in May of 1944. Before that, the dead and the dying were sent back to Mauthausen. Ebensee was the satellite camp of Mauthausen, where Itzhak Sladowski was living out his nightmare. He was most likely, as Reuben stated, sent to Ebensee on any given day for torturous slave labor. In 1945, mass graves were dug because there were so many deaths. When the camp was liberated in 1945, there were 16,000 prisoners. The Germans kept impeccable records. Everything was documented. We know from those records that at one time there were as many as 18,000 prisoners from 20 different nationalities, and that the Jews were the most harshly treated. By the end of the Second World War, Ebensee is 40% Jewish. It's interesting to note that after the war, the Austrian government demolished everything. No more barracks, no more barbed wire fences, no more anything. And the Austrian government gave the land to people to build houses. It became a neighborhood to erase the evil that was once done there. It's not until 1988 that the president of Austria, Kurt Waldheim, who happened to be morally complicit for some Nazi crimes himself, but nevertheless, he was president of Austria in 1988, and he said it was time for Austria to face its past. And it's not until 2012 that a special memorial is built with 8,500 names of people who were once only known by numbers. And if you go back to that slide before, you'll see that there's an archway there at the neighborhood with a small memorial plaque that denotes where the barracks once existed. In May of 2014, 69 years after my father had helped to liberate the concentration camp of Ebensee, my husband Harvey and I go there. The day was dark and dank and dreary and rainy. It was appropriate for the visit. We drove through the beautiful little resort town of Ebensee with its clock tower and its lake, and realized that the concentration camp had only been 2 miles from the center of town. The forest was thick, there was an existing rock quarry, and the efficient rail lines were still there. As I got out of the car and I began to retrace my father's step, there was a train coming down those tracks blowing that eerie whistle, and I thought about the masses of humanity that had once been packed into those cattle cars, many of whom had died standing up. I began my walk up the long and winding roads to the tunnels, where as many as 15,000 prisoners had worked to build munitions and store munitions for the Third Reich. The ultimate goal had been to build a jet plane and missiles that would reach the United States. We saw the markers for the mass graves and the memorials built by other countries whose citizens had been transported there and who had died there. When I saw the memorial placed by the State of Israel, I couldn't help but wonder how many of those Jews of Europe might have been spared had there been an Israel to accept them when so many other countries had closed their doors. I want to tell you about a promise now. When Aaron returned home to Columbus, Georgia in 1945, no one wanted to talk about the war, and no one wanted to hear about what he had seen. But he had made a promise, and he was haunted by it. He had made a promise to an Austrian survivor. It was a man who was a prominent attorney. His family had lived in Vienna for over 800 years. He had been awarded the Austrian Iron Cross for bravery in the First World War. And he said to Aaron, "Look at me now. I'm a walking cadaver. My children, my wife, my family, all murdered, and simply because we were born of the Jewish faith." And he said to Aaron, "Promise me when you get back to the United States, you won't forget about us and you will tell our story." And Aaron said, "I promise, and I will tell your story." And here is a picture of Aaron at age 95 as he kept that promise to that survivor for the rest of his life. Now that my father and Reuben's father can no longer tell the story, we embrace the responsibility. I am my father's daughter, and Reuben is his father's son. We are their legacy, and now we are their voice. The atrocities that Aaron Cohn and Itzhak Sladowski saw and suffered during the Second World War, as you know, changed their lives forever. Once there is hatred, it can be boundless and everyone suffers. To paraphrase an adage that I believe to be true, is all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. Aaron became a legend for the good that he had done. He received hundreds of awards during his lifetime, and today awards are given in his name. His legacy lives on through his book, Memoirs of a First-Generation American, the Aaron Cohn Youth Detention Center, and the Aaron Cohn Middle School. And tonight you can see the Holocaust exhibit, which is dedicated to him and is right behind us in this very hall at the end of the World War II exhibit. There's a plaque, and it alludes to the fact that he was a liberator, a jurist, and a patriot. On display is the replica of that portrait with Aaron in his .45 shoulder holster gun, exactly as he looked when he walked into that concentration camp that Itzhak Sladowski survived. This portrait was painted by a survivor on his last day in that nightmarish camp of Ebensee, Austria, a satellite camp of Mauthausen. Aaron Cohn was born March the 3rd, 1916, and he died on the anniversary of America's independence, July 4th. The year was 2012. There was a 21-gun salute, and General H.R. McMaster, who was then the head of Fort Benning, gave one of the eulogies, and taps was played. Indeed, it was an appropriate date because central to Aaron's life was his love for our great nation of opportunities, choices, and religious freedoms. Aaron always said, "We must remember the lessons of history. 6 million Jews and 5 million non-Jews died, and all because they were perceived as somehow different." Among those murdered were 1.5 million Jewish children who never had a chance at life. It was the impetus for Aaron to become the oldest serving, longest sitting juvenile court judge in the country. He was on the bench for 46 years and he retired at 95. You and I know that we must stand up against injustice so that women and children and men, such as Reuben Sloan's father, will never again be faced with the worst of humanity, our inhumanity. On behalf of our fathers, let me conclude with the words my father, Aaron Cohn, would use were he with you today. May God bless each of you, and may God bless America.
For this to happen again, we just need to do nothing. And it's happening again in the Ukraine, so we have to do something. So I don't know if anybody has questions or comments. And we have some other things, but at the end of the whole program, we've made special arrangements for people to go into the World War II exhibit and see the dedication to Gail's father. Does anybody have questions or comments? Or it's a pretty heavy subject, and it had to be told because, again, this is what I learned here. Treat your patients like they're your friends, and great things come of it. I never would have known about this connection. So I am in debt to the Houston Clinic. Thank you.